Elena Carter had always been careful with her health, especially now that she was 7 months pregnant. Every morning, she lined up her prenatal vitamins like little soldiers on the kitchen counter, reminding herself she was no longer living for just herself, but for the tiny heartbeat growing inside her. That morning, though, fatigue got the better of her. Between the endless backaches and the restless nights, she had forgotten to take her pills. By noon, guilt gnawed at her. She decided to swing by her husband's office, where she kept a spare bottle in his desk. It was supposed to be a simple stop, nothing more than a quick detour before heading home to rest. The city air was brisk as she stepped out of the taxi, one hand cradling her belly, the other holding her purse. The towering glass building where her husband, Richard Carter, ruled as CEO loomed above her like a monument to power. She had always felt small stepping inside, like an accessory rather than a partner. Still, she reminded herself that Richard was providing her with a life of luxury, and in return, she played the supportive wife. Inside the lobby, polished marble floors gleamed under the soft lighting. Employees rushed past her, whispering greetings, their eyes flicking to her rounded stomach before darting away. She had been there many times before, but something about today felt different, heavy, tense, as though the walls themselves were holding secrets. She pressed the elevator button, her mind wandering. Maybe she would surprise Richard with lunch after taking her pills. He liked to be admired, and she thought, perhaps foolishly, that such gestures reminded him of the love they once had. The ding of the elevator broke her thoughts, and within moments she was stepping into the hushed, carpeted hallway of the executive floor. Richard's office door was slightly ajar. At first, she thought nothing of it. He often left it open during meetings. She walked closer, adjusting the scarf around her neck, when voices drifted out, familiar voices. She froze. "She's useless now." Richard's voice was sharp, dripping with disdain. "All she does is eat, sleep, and complain. I need someone who inspires me." Elena's heart thudded painfully against her ribs. A softer voice answered, one that made her stomach twist. Melissa Gray, her best friend, the woman who had held Elena's hand through college exams, who had stood beside her at her wedding, who had promised to be a sister for life. "Don't worry," Melissa purred. "Once the baby's here, she'll fade into the background. You and I will be unstoppable." Elena's vision blurred. She staggered back a step, her palm pressing harder against her belly, as if shielding her child from the poison seeping into her ears. Every word felt like a blade. She should leave. She should run before they noticed. But something inside her, stronger than fear, urged her forward. Quietly, she pushed the door open just an inch more. And what she saw turned her world upside down. Richard, her husband, leaning over his desk, his lips pressed firmly against Melissa's. For a moment, Elena couldn't breathe. The man she had sacrificed everything for, her career, her independence, her dreams, was betraying her not just with anyone, but with the very friend she trusted most. Her hand trembled on the doorframe, her throat closed. A tear slid down her cheek. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then Richard's eyes flicked up, and for the first time he saw her standing there. Elena Carter had not always been the fragile, tearful woman who now stood trembling outside her husband's office. Once, she had been a star. Born and raised in a respectable family in Chicago, Elena carried both beauty and brains. She studied architecture at one of the top universities, winning awards for her bold designs that blended modern innovation with timeless grace. Professors praised her for her vision. Colleagues admired her determination. She dreamed of one day opening her own firm, building homes that told stories of love and family. But then came Richard Carter. She met him at a charity gala when she was just 23. He was older, confident, and charming, already climbing the corporate ladder with a ruthless ambition that dazzled everyone around him. His tailored suit, his smooth words, his ability to command a room. He was magnetic. To Elena, who had grown up craving both security and recognition, Richard seemed like destiny. Their romance was a whirlwind. Within months, he swept her into a lifestyle she had never imagined. Lavish dinners, weekend getaways, surprise gifts that left her speechless. It all felt like a fairy tale. When he asked her to marry him, she didn't hesitate. She believed she had found not only love, but also a partner who would stand beside her through every storm. At first, life was beautiful. Richard was attentive, affectionate, proud to show her off to his colleagues as his stunning young wife. But little by little, the cracks began to show. He started to question her career. "Why do you need to work?" he would say with a smirk. "I make enough for both of us. Besides, an architect's life is stressful. Why don't you focus on being a perfect wife instead?" At first she resisted. She loved her work. She wanted to build something of her own. But Richard had a way of wearing her down. "Think of our future children," he pressed. "Do you want to be too busy for them?" Eventually, Elena gave in, telling herself that love was about compromise. She put aside her drafting pencils, boxed up her blueprints, and devoted herself to building Richard's world instead of her own. Years passed. She filled her days with volunteer work, hosting Richard's business associates and planning a family. But the emptiness grew. Richard became colder, less present. He spent long nights at the office, claiming to fight for the future of their company. Elena told herself he was just stressed, that once the baby arrived, he would soften. When she found out she was pregnant, Elena's heart soared. She imagined Richard's joy, their home filled with laughter, the nursery painted in soft colors, and for a moment she thought she saw a spark of the man she once loved. He kissed her belly, promised to be a better husband, and said, "This child will change everything." But now, standing in that hallway, she knew the truth. The only thing that had changed was her. She had gone from a fierce, independent woman to a shadow, a woman whose sacrifices were met not with gratitude, but with betrayal. She pressed her back against the cold wall, tears spilling freely. The baby kicked inside her as if sensing her anguish. She whispered, almost to herself, "I gave up everything for him. Everything." Her world was crumbling, but deep inside, a spark flickered. It was faint, buried under years of silence, but it was there. The Elena who once dreamed, who once fought, who once built. And that spark was about to ignite. The world Richard Carter built was dazzling from the outside. To the public eye, the Carters lived a dream life, one that belonged on the glossy covers of magazines. Their mansion sat on the edge of Lake Michigan, its towering glass windows reflecting the city lights like a jewel in the night. Inside, every corner was immaculate. Marble floors polished until they shone, crystal chandeliers dripping elegance, and furniture imported from Europe. It was the kind of home that whispered wealth, power, and status. Visitors would gasp at the spiral staircase, the grand piano in the living room, the gallery of expensive art that lined the walls. They would envy Elena for the life she seemed to lead, imagining her days filled with luxury and comfort. But appearances, as always, were deceiving. To Elena, the mansion was more prison than palace. The vast rooms felt cold, echoing with silence. The walls that others admired seemed to close in on her, trapping her in a role she no longer recognized. There were no family photos on the walls, no laughter bouncing down the hallways. The nursery, which she had decorated herself with soft cream tones and tiny stuffed animals, was the only room that carried warmth. She would sit there for hours, stroking her belly, whispering promises to her unborn child. "You will never feel alone, not like me." Richard's office was another world entirely. Located in a towering skyscraper in downtown Chicago, it embodied everything about his ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the skyline, his desk made of mahogany that gleamed under the city lights. His employees revered him, fearing his temper but admiring his brilliance. To them, he was the man who turned everything he touched into gold. To Elena, he was a stranger who had built an empire but abandoned his home. Melissa, of course, was always around. She appeared at Richard's events, smiling sweetly at Elena as though nothing were amiss. At charity galas, she whispered in Richard's ear, while Elena stood quietly at his side, pretending not to notice. Guests assumed Melissa was just a dear friend, someone loyal to the family. No one saw the way Richard's hand lingered too long on Melissa's back, or how their eyes locked across the room like conspirators sharing a dangerous secret. It was during one of these events, the Bright Horizons Gala, that Elena truly felt the depth of her isolation. She arrived in a flowing maternity gown, her hands resting protectively over her belly. Cameras flashed, journalists asked questions about Richard's leadership, and no one cared to ask her how she was doing. She stood in a sea of laughter and champagne, and yet she had never felt lonelier. As she watched Richard hold Melissa's arm a little too tightly, Elena realized she was invisible. The mansion, the office, the glittering galas, they weren't her world. They were his stage. And she was just a prop, placed carefully to complete the image of perfection. But what no one knew, what even Richard himself had forgotten, was that Elena was not just a decorative piece. She was the daughter of a powerful family, one that had taught her resilience. For years, she had buried that side of herself to fit into Richard's script. But betrayal has a way of unlocking old doors. She placed a hand over her stomach, feeling another kick from her baby. It was a reminder, a silent voice urging her to fight back. And soon, the cold halls of their mansion would no longer echo with silence. They would tremble with the storm she was about to unleash. Richard Carter had always been admired by outsiders, but those who worked closely with him knew the truth. He was a man consumed by ambition. To his employees, he was a ruthless CEO who demanded perfection and punished failure without mercy. Every deal had to be bigger, every profit margin higher. He thrived on control, not just in business but in every corner of his life. When Richard first married Elena, he wore the mask of the perfect husband. He brought her flowers, made grand gestures, and whispered about building a family together. But the moment Elena gave up her career, his respect for her vanished. He began to see her as less of a partner and more of an accessory, a beautiful woman to parade at events, nothing more. His words at home turned cold, laced with disdain. "You should be grateful," he often sneered. "Do you think anyone else would give you this life?" What Richard craved was not love, but power, and that hunger found the perfect accomplice in Melissa Gray. Melissa had been Elena's closest friend in college, a confidant who had shared secrets, dreams, and long nights of laughter. She was the one who stood beside Elena on her wedding day, smiling as if she couldn't be happier for her friend. But behind that smile was envy, a deep, festering jealousy of everything Elena had. Melissa had always wanted wealth, influence, and the kind of life Richard could offer. It began subtly. Melissa visited often under the pretense of checking on Elena's pregnancy. She brought homemade soup, offered to help with errands, and held Elena's hand during doctor visits when Richard was too busy. She played the role of the devoted friend so well that Elena never suspected her betrayal. But when Richard and Melissa were alone, the mask slipped. Their conversations were laced with whispered promises and dangerous schemes. "You deserve someone who understands your ambition," Melissa would purr, leaning closer than necessary. "And you," Richard replied, his voice low, "deserve more than playing second to Elena." What bound them together was more than lust. It was greed. Melissa fed Richard's ego, convincing him he was destined for greatness, while Richard dangled before her the life she craved. Together, they planned not only to betray Elena's trust, but to erase her entirely. Richard started transferring company assets into accounts Melissa controlled, slowly building a future that excluded his wife. Melissa, emboldened, began attending meetings as if she were already the new Mrs. Carter. Employees whispered, but no one dared to speak out. In their eyes, Melissa had already replaced Elena. The cruelty of their betrayal was not just in their actions, but in their shamelessness. They no longer hid their intimacy. At a private board dinner, Elena watched Richard brush Melissa's hand beneath the table. At a charity ball, she caught Melissa whispering into Richard's ear, their faces far too close. Each time, Elena told herself she must be imagining it, that her pregnancy hormones were playing tricks on her. But deep inside, she knew the truth. Richard and Melissa were not content with stealing her husband-wife bond. They wanted everything: her marriage, her home, her child's future. And when Elena overheard Richard mutter to Melissa, "Once the baby's born, she'll be irrelevant," she realized their betrayal had crossed into cruelty she could never forgive. What they didn't know was that the woman they dismissed as weak was about to rise stronger than ever. The Bright Horizons charity gala was supposed to be an evening of celebration. For Elena, it was an escape. One night to remind herself she was still part of Richard's world, not just a shadow fading in the background. She wore a flowing midnight blue gown that hugged her 7-month belly gracefully, her hair pinned back with soft curls. As she looked in the mirror before leaving, she told herself, "Maybe tonight, he will remember who I am." The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, polished marble floors reflecting the light like diamonds scattered beneath the guests' feet. Politicians, investors, and media figures mingled, their laughter echoing across the hall. Cameras flashed as Richard entered, tall and commanding in his tuxedo. Elena stood at his side, her hand on his arm, though his eyes barely acknowledged her. He was too busy scanning the crowd, too focused on the image he projected. And then Melissa appeared. She wore a crimson gown that clung to her like a second skin, her lips painted the same shade. Guests whispered as she entered, some recognizing her as Elena's best friend. But tonight, she did not play the part of the loyal sister. Tonight, she radiated possession. Elena watched in silence as Melissa glided toward Richard, her smile confident, her gaze fixed solely on him. Richard's expression softened instantly, his lips curling into the kind of smile he hadn't shown Elena in months. Elena's stomach tightened, not from the baby's kick this time, but from the sharp blade of realization. At first, Melissa played coy, speaking softly, resting a delicate hand on Richard's shoulder. But as the night went on, the boundaries dissolved. Elena stood just feet away when Richard leaned closer, his voice low but not low enough to hide from her. "She's nothing but a burden now," he muttered, his eyes flicking dismissively toward Elena. "Always tired, always complaining. Melissa, you inspire me in ways she never could." Laughter spilled from Melissa's lips, light and cruel. "Then let her fade. Once the baby is here, she'll be tied to diapers and sleepless nights. That's not the life for a man like you. You need someone who can keep up with you, someone like me." The words slammed into Elena like a physical blow. Her knees wobbled, and she gripped the edge of the table for balance. She wanted to scream, to shatter every glass in the room with the force of her pain. But all around her, people smiled and toasted, oblivious to the cruelty unfolding in whispers. Her throat burned as tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she turned away, her body trembling, her hand cradling her swollen belly. She needed air. She needed to protect the fragile life inside her from the venom of their betrayal. She stumbled out onto the balcony, the cold night wind slapping her cheeks. She pressed both hands over her stomach, whispering shakily, "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Behind her, the laughter continued. The gala roared on with champagne and applause, unaware that in the shadows, a woman's world had just collapsed. And yet, as Elena looked up at the glittering city skyline, something inside her shifted. The devastation was still raw, but beneath it, a spark flickered. A spark that refused to die. Because what Richard and Melissa didn't know was that this night, this humiliation, would mark the beginning of Elena's revenge. The drive home from the gala was a blur. Elena sat in the back of the car, her hands clasped tightly over her belly, as though she could shield her unborn child from the poison she had absorbed that night. Richard rode in the front beside the driver, speaking briskly on his phone, never once glancing at her. His words were sharp, full of numbers, deals, and plans, as if the cruel things he'd whispered to Melissa had never left his lips. Elena stared out the window, her reflection pale against the city lights. Inside her chest, her heart pounded like a drum, too fast, too heavy. Every breath felt shallow, like her lungs refused to open fully. The baby shifted inside her, and instead of comfort, the movement sent panic shooting through her veins. By the time they reached the mansion, her body was trembling. Richard stepped out first, barking instructions to a colleague over the phone. He didn't notice how Elena clutched the car door for support, her legs wobbling under her weight. He didn't hear her whisper, "Please, not now. Not my baby." Inside, the house was as silent and cold as always. Elena staggered to the nursery, collapsing into the rocking chair she had placed by the window. She rubbed her belly in frantic circles, whispering, "Hold on, sweetheart. Please, hold on." Then the pain struck. It started as a sharp cramp, then another, deeper, rolling through her abdomen with brutal force. She gasped, doubling over, clutching her belly as fear ripped through her. She tried to call out, but her voice cracked into a sob. Tears blurred her vision. She had read about premature labor, about the dangers of stress during pregnancy, but now it was happening, and she was alone. She fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking. She dialed Richard, but the call went unanswered. He was still in his office downstairs, too busy to notice his wife struggling to breathe. She tried Melissa's number out of desperation before realizing the cruelty of it. Melissa wasn't a friend anymore. She was the reason Elena was in this agony. Dropping the phone to the floor, Elena sobbed, rocking back and forth, every nerve in her body screaming with terror. Finally, she managed to press the emergency number. Within minutes, flashing red lights lit up the driveway as paramedics rushed inside. They found her crumpled on the floor of the nursery, drenched in sweat, her breath ragged. "Stay with us, ma'am," one of them said firmly, checking her vitals. "We're taking you to the hospital right now." Elena's vision swam as they lifted her onto the stretcher. The baby kicked again, weaker this time, and she whispered through chattering teeth, "Please don't take my baby. Please." The ambulance sped through the city, sirens wailing. Elena lay staring at the ceiling, the fluorescent lights flashing above her in a blur. Every bump on the road made her heart race. She closed her eyes, praying to a God she wasn't even sure she believed in anymore. By the time they reached the hospital, her strength was nearly gone. Doctors and nurses surrounded her, urgent voices filling the room. She felt hands on her, heard machines beeping, but it all faded into a haze. Then through the fog, she heard one sentence, clear as day. "We're losing the baby if we don't stabilize her now." The hospital room was filled with a frantic energy. Machines beeped in rapid rhythm, doctors spoke in urgent tones, and nurses moved swiftly with syringes and monitors. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness, her body drenched in sweat, her breath shallow. Her world had shrunk to the pounding of her heart and the fragile kicks inside her belly that seemed weaker with each passing moment. She searched for Richard's face, but he wasn't there. Hours passed, yet no husband came running through the doors, no comforting hand squeezed hers. Instead, the chair beside her bed remained empty, a cruel reminder of his absence. Then the door swung open. "Elena," a voice said firmly. Her eyes fluttered open. Standing there was Lucas Bennett. It had been years since she'd last seen him, yet his presence felt instantly familiar. Lucas, once her friend in college, once the man who had admired her designs and encouraged her to follow her dreams. He looked older now, more refined, his tailored suit slightly wrinkled from rushing, but his eyes still carried that same steady warmth she remembered. He moved quickly to her bedside, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, taking her trembling hand in his. Her lips quivered. "How? How did you know?" Lucas glanced at the doctors, then back at her. "Let's just say people still care about you, Elena, even if your husband doesn't." The words stung, not because they weren't true, but because they confirmed what her heart already knew. Richard hadn't even bothered to show up. He was probably with Melissa, sipping champagne while Elena fought for her life and their child's. As the doctors worked, Lucas stayed by her side. He spoke calmly, his deep voice steadying her frayed nerves. "You're stronger than you think. You're going to get through this, and so will your baby. Do you hear me?" A tear slipped down Elena's cheek. For the first time in months, someone was speaking to her with belief, not dismissal. She nodded weakly, clinging to his hand like it was the only thing tethering her to life. Hours dragged on. Finally, the monitors slowed, the doctors' voices softened, and one of them turned with a small smile. "She's stable, the baby is safe, for now, but stress must be avoided at all costs." Relief washed over Elena, but exhaustion pulled her under again. When she woke hours later, the room was quiet. Lucas was still there, sitting in the chair Richard should have occupied. His jacket was draped over the back, his tie loosened, but his posture remained alert, protective. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Because I won't let them destroy you." Confusion flickered across her tired eyes. "Them?" "Richard. Melissa. I know what they've been doing," Lucas said, his jaw tightening. "And I know more than you think. I've seen the transfers, the secret meetings. He's not just betraying you, he's putting everything at risk, even your name." Elena's heart skipped. She thought she was drowning in betrayal already, but Lucas's words hinted at something deeper, something more sinister than an affair. Her pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Lucas hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice low and deliberate. "Elena, your husband isn't just cheating, he's planning to erase you completely." Elena stared at Lucas, her breath catching in her throat. The steady beep of the monitor beside her bed suddenly felt deafening, like a ticking clock counting down to some inevitable catastrophe. "Erase me?" she whispered, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. Lucas leaned closer, his voice low but urgent. Richard isn't just having an affair, Elena. He's been moving assets under Melissa's name, shifting company shares, even altering documents that tie back to you. If this continues, by the time the baby arrives, you'll have nothing. Not your marriage, not your home, not even your name on the company. He's preparing to cut you out completely. Her chest tightened, not from panic this time, but from fury. Betrayal in marriage was devastating enough, but betrayal in blood and ink, the kind that could steal her child's future, was unforgivable. She shook her head slowly, disbelief fighting with rage. Why would he do this, after everything I gave up for him? Lucas's eyes softened with pity, but his jaw clenched with restrained anger. Because Richard doesn't see you as a partner. To him, you're disposable. Melissa is feeding his ego, making him believe he can rebuild everything without you. And Richard's arrogance is blinding him to the fact that you're far stronger than either of them realizes. Elena's fingers dug into the sheets. She thought back to every sacrifice. Shelving her career, leaving behind the drafting boards she loved, trading late-night projects for late-night loneliness. She remembered Richard's words at the gala. She's a burden. And Melissa's cruel laughter. Her stomach twisted, but this time it wasn't just pain, it was fire. For years she had buried her true self beneath the role of Richard's wife. But the woman who once dreamed of building empires with her own hands was still alive inside her. And for her baby, for the tiny heartbeat she had nearly lost tonight, she would rise again. Lucas reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, thick with papers. I've been watching him, he confessed. Not just as your friend, but as his competitor. These are copies of transfers, shell companies, falsified records. Richard is reckless, Elena. He thinks no one notices because everyone fears him. But I noticed, and now you need to. Her trembling hands reached for the folder. She flipped through the documents, her eyes scanning numbers and signatures that painted a picture of betrayal deeper than she'd imagined. Each page was another cut, another wound. By the time she reached the end, tears blurred her vision, not of weakness, but of rage and clarity. He wants to erase me, she said quietly, almost to herself. Then he'll regret not finishing the job tonight. Lucas's gaze locked on hers, a flicker of admiration sparking in his eyes. That's the Elena I remember, the woman who never backed down, who could design something magnificent out of ruins. Elena straightened slowly, her hand resting protectively over her belly. I won't let them take everything from me. Not my child, not my life, not anymore. The room was silent for a long moment, broken only by the hum of machines. Then Elena whispered, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet, Lucas, help me burn them to the ground. The morning after her hospital scare, Elena sat upright in her bed, her body still fragile but her spirit sharper than it had been in years. The soft light of dawn streamed through the blinds, casting long golden lines across her face. She had nearly lost everything. Her baby, her future, her sanity. But instead of leaving her broken, that night had left her forged like steel. The Elena who had once been content to stay silent was gone. She began with the simplest step, reclaiming herself. A nurse wheeled in a mirror so she could freshen up, but when Elena caught her reflection, she barely recognized the pale, weary woman staring back at her. Her hair hung limp, her skin was drained, and her eyes, once so full of fire, looked dulled. No more, she whispered. With deliberate slowness she brushed her hair until it gleamed, pulling it back into a sleek bun that framed her face with strength rather than fragility. She dabbed color onto her cheeks, applied a touch of lipstick, and for the first time in months, she saw hints of the woman she used to be. The woman who had once been admired for her brilliance, not pitied for her sacrifices. When Lucas arrived that afternoon, carrying another stack of documents, his eyes widened slightly. You look different. Elena smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. I feel different. Together they pored over files, piecing together Richard's betrayal in all its ugly detail. Each discovery lit a fire inside her, each forged signature and hidden transfer fueling the storm that was building. Lucas explained how Richard had slowly funneled funds into shell companies using Melissa as a front. He was positioning himself to cut Elena out entirely once the baby was born, leaving her with nothing. But what Richard hadn't counted on was Elena's awakening. By evening, Elena insisted on leaving the hospital. The doctors warned her to rest, but she promised to be cautious. Lucas drove her back to the mansion. As the car rolled through the wrought iron gates, Elena stared at the place that had once felt like a dream and now looked like a gilded cage. She stepped inside with new eyes. The marble floors no longer intimidated her. The grand chandelier no longer dazzled her. This was not her prison. It was her battlefield. She moved through the halls with a determination that startled even herself. She gathered the photographs Richard had demanded they take down, the ones of her early career, her awards, her designs. She lined them on the dresser in the nursery, reclaiming the pieces of herself he had tried to erase. Lucas watched quietly, offering no interruption. He seemed to understand that this was not just about revenge, it was about resurrection. When Elena finally turned back to him, her voice was steady. "If Richard thinks he can erase me, he's forgotten who I am. I may have given up my career for him, but I never lost my mind, and I will use everything I know to destroy him." Lucas nodded. "Then let's start. But you'll need allies. You can't do this alone." Elena's hand rested on her belly as her baby shifted inside her. She looked out the window at the glittering city skyline, her reflection now one of resolve rather than despair. "Then we'll build an army," she said, "and when we strike, he'll never see it coming." The days following her release from the hospital were unlike any Elena had lived before. For the first time in years, she wasn't moving in Richard's shadow, she was moving against him. Her transformation wasn't loud, it was quiet, methodical, deliberate. Elena understood that to win, she couldn't simply confront Richard head-on. She had to dismantle him piece by piece, and that meant building an army. Her first step was reaching out to people Richard underestimated. She began with Margaret, a senior secretary who had worked in Richard's company for over 2 decades. Margaret had seen everything: the late nights, the sudden transfers, the inappropriate closeness between Richard and Melissa. When Elena invited her for coffee, Margaret's guard was high at first. But as soon as Elena confessed she knew about the affair and the financial betrayals, Margaret's eyes filled with quiet relief. "I thought no one noticed," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "I've wanted to say something for months, but Richard has power. He ruins anyone who crosses him." "Then let him try," Elena replied calmly. "I won't let him ruin me, and I won't let him ruin this company. I need people I can trust. Will you help me?" Margaret hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "You're stronger than he thinks, Elena, stronger than he'll ever admit. I'm with you." That was the first ally. Others followed. A junior accountant, nervous but eager, slipped Elena a file of suspicious transfers. A mid-level manager admitted he'd overheard Richard promising Melissa a future as his partner in power. Slowly, a network formed. People tired of Richard's arrogance, people who believed Elena could restore balance. Meanwhile, Richard and Melissa grew bolder. They flaunted their closeness at company events, convinced Elena was too broken to fight back. Richard dismissed her entirely, treating her like she was nothing more than a fragile, pregnant wife who could barely manage her own household, let alone threaten his empire. At one board meeting, Richard even joked, "Elena's practically on bed rest. She wouldn't know a balance sheet if it hit her in the face." Laughter echoed around the table, Melissa smirking at his side. But what Richard didn't notice was the way a few board members exchanged uneasy glances, their loyalty beginning to shift. Lucas, ever the strategist, reminded Elena to be patient. "He's arrogant. He thinks you're weak. That's your advantage. Let him keep underestimating you. By the time he realizes the truth, it will be too late." So Elena waited. She gathered files, testimonies, and evidence like weapons, each one sharpened for the day of reckoning. At night, she would sit in the nursery, her hand resting on her belly, whispering to her unborn child, "This is for you. You'll be born into a world where no one can take what's rightfully yours." For the first time since the betrayal, hope flickered in her chest. The cold mansion no longer felt like a prison. It felt like the place where she was plotting her freedom. But just as Elena began to feel control returning to her hands, a letter arrived one morning, hand-delivered, sealed with the company's crest. She tore it open, her pulse quickening. Inside was a legal notice. Richard had filed for divorce. The envelope trembled in Elena's hands. Her first instinct was denial. Perhaps it was a mistake, a cruel trick from Richard's lawyers. But as she unfolded the crisp, heavy sheets, the words glared at her in black ink: petition for dissolution of marriage. Her heart sank. Richard wasn't even trying to pretend anymore. He wanted her gone. The document was brutal. Not only did Richard demand full control of their shared assets, but he also claimed Elena was unfit to manage finances due to emotional instability during pregnancy. The words felt like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. He had even dared to suggest that custody of their unborn child should be reviewed, citing her fragile health. Tears burned her eyes, but they weren't the helpless tears of the past. They were hot, furious tears of betrayal. Richard wasn't just discarding her, he was attempting to erase her completely, exactly as Lucas had warned. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly. "He will never take you from me," she whispered fiercely. "Never." Lucas arrived minutes later, his sharp eyes catching the papers immediately. "So it's begun," he said grimly. Elena handed him the document, her voice shaking with rage. "He's calling me unstable. He's using my pregnancy against me." Lucas scanned the pages quickly, his jaw tightening. Classic Richard. He thinks your vulnerability makes you weak, but this... He tapped the paper. "This is proof he's terrified. He wants to eliminate you before you can fight back." For a moment, Elena faltered. What if he wins? What if he takes everything? Lucas leaned closer, his voice steady, grounding her. "Then we make sure he doesn't. Elena, you're not just some housewife he can discard. You're Elena Carter, the woman who gave up her career for him, the woman who carried his child. You have more power than he's willing to admit, and it's time you use it." Something inside Elena shifted. The despair that had threatened to swallow her transformed into a steady, burning determination. She wasn't going to crumble. She was going to fight. That afternoon, she began preparing her counterattack. Lucas connected her with a powerful legal team, specialists who weren't intimidated by Richard's money or influence. She gathered every shred of evidence: receipts of Richard's luxury trips with Melissa, records of suspicious bank transfers, photos of the two of them together at events where she had been excluded. Each piece was added to a growing arsenal that would prove Richard not only unfaithful, but also unfit to control the empire he had built. For the first time in months, Elena felt in control. She wasn't reacting anymore. She was planning. Every breath she took, every step she made was for her child's future. Late that night, she sat alone in the nursery, staring at the crib she had assembled herself. The soft blankets and tiny stuffed animals seemed to glow under the lamplight. She placed a hand over her belly and whispered, "We're going to win. You and me. We're going to take back everything he tried to steal." Then her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message flashed across the screen, anonymous but chilling. "Stop what you're doing, Elena, or you'll regret it." The message glowed on Elena's phone screen like a warning shot fired straight into her heart. "Stop what you're doing, or you'll regret it." Her first reaction was fear. Her hands shook as she clutched the phone, her pulse thundering in her ears. Who had sent it? Richard? Melissa? One of their hired men? The thought of danger so close sent a chill down her spine, but as the fear surged, another feeling rose higher: anger. For months, she'd been treated as fragile, powerless, irrelevant. But now someone dared to threaten her, thinking it would scare her into silence. Instead, it hardened her resolve. She pressed her hand against her belly, whispering, "They think they can intimidate me. They have no idea who they're dealing with." The next morning, she showed the message to Lucas. His jaw tightened as he read it. "This isn't just Richard being reckless anymore. He knows you're building a case. He's scared." "Good," Elena replied coldly. "Let him be scared. He should be." Lucas studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "But we need to be careful. He's not above playing dirty. He's proven that already. If he feels cornered, he'll lash out." Elena's eyes hardened. "Then let him. I won't be silenced." Together, they doubled down on their efforts. Elena met quietly with more allies from within the company, people Richard had overlooked or mistreated. An IT specialist slipped her records of emails Richard thought he had deleted. A financial officer revealed accounts that had been hidden offshore. Every new discovery painted Richard and Melissa into a tighter corner. But Elena wasn't just gathering evidence. She was reclaiming herself. She began showing up to places Richard thought she'd avoid: board luncheons, charity committees, small industry gatherings. Her presence turned heads. The whispers began. Elena's back. She doesn't look broken anymore. She looks stronger. Melissa noticed. At one event, Melissa cornered Elena in the ladies' room, her lips curling into a venomous smile. "You should quit while you still have a shred of dignity," she sneered. "Richard will crush you. He always wins." Elena met her gaze in the mirror, her reflection calm, unshaken. "Funny," she said evenly, "because last I checked, I was still his wife. And you? You're just a shadow who only exists when he allows it." For the first time, Melissa's smirk faltered. Elena walked out with her head held high, her resolve stronger than ever. That night, back at the mansion, Elena sat in the nursery, the soft glow of the lamp lighting her face. She whispered to her unborn child, "They think I'm weak, but they'll learn soon enough. I'll fight for you, and when the world sees what they've done, they'll never hurt us again." But just as peace began to settle over her, the phone buzzed again. Another message appeared, harsher than the last. "This is your final warning. Next time, it won't just be words." Elena's breath caught. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Whoever was behind these threats wasn't playing games anymore. And deep down, she knew the next move Richard and Melissa made could put not just her future, but her baby's life in danger. The threats should have broken her. Months earlier, Elena would have collapsed under the weight of fear, retreating into silence while Richard and Melissa took everything. But not now. Not after everything she had endured. Instead, the threats became fuel. Elena decided it was time to stop hiding. If Richard wanted the world to see her as weak, she would show them something else entirely, a woman reborn. The transformation began one morning when Lucas picked her up and drove her to an upscale boutique on Michigan Avenue. The polished glass doors reflected Elena's tired eyes, but Lucas's voice was steady. "If you want to fight them on their battlefield, you have to look like you belong there. You can't just be Elena the wife anymore. You have to become Elena the force." Inside, racks of designer dresses glimmered under soft lights. Fabrics whispered promises of power and elegance. For a moment, Elena hesitated. She had spent years blending into the background, wearing soft pastels Richard preferred, clothes that made her look gentle, non-threatening, forgettable. But that woman was gone. She stepped into a fitting room with a gown of deep emerald silk. When she emerged, the mirror reflected a stranger, or perhaps the woman she had buried long ago. The dress hugged her figure gracefully, her 7-month belly not hidden but accentuated, a symbol of strength rather than weakness. A jeweler clasped a diamond necklace around her throat, and the sparkle wasn't just from the gems but from her eyes, which glowed with something fierce. Lucas's lips curved into a rare smile. "Now that," he said softly, "is the Elena Richard should have feared all along." The makeover didn't stop at appearances. Elena began practicing her voice, her posture, the way she carried herself. Lucas arranged for her to meet with a speech coach, an older woman who taught her how to command a room with a single glance, how to let silence work as power, how to turn vulnerability into presence. Night after night, Elena studied. She read through legal documents, company reports, market analyses. She wanted to be ready for every question, every doubt. Richard thought she didn't know a balance sheet from a grocery list, but soon she would know more about his empire than he did. Her allies noticed the change. Margaret, the loyal secretary, whispered after a board luncheon, "You look like a queen walking into battle." Employees who once pitied her now looked at her with cautious admiration. But perhaps the most telling moment came when Melissa saw her again. At another charity function, Elena entered in a sleek black gown, her hair styled in waves, her confidence radiating. Melissa's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing as she whispered something hurriedly to Richard. For the first time, it wasn't Elena who looked like the outsider. It was them. That night, Elena returned home, standing before the mirror in the nursery. She stroked her belly gently, whispering, "Do you see me now, little one? Your mother is not broken. She is strong. She will protect you." Her reflection looked back, no longer frail, no longer forgotten. This was Elena Carter, the woman who had been erased, now rewritten in power and fire. And as she stared into her own eyes, she said the words that sealed her transformation. "Richard took my love for weakness. Now he'll learn my strength is his downfall." Elena had the look, the voice, and the fire, but she knew image alone wasn't enough. To defeat Richard, she needed power, and in his world, power meant allies, real allies. Her first move was subtle. With Lucas's help, she began reaching out to shareholders, men and women who had once bowed to Richard's charm but now quietly resented his arrogance. Elena invited them to private lunches, coffee meetings, discreet dinners away from the glittering eyes of the city. At first, they were skeptical. Many still saw her as Richard's fragile wife, the woman who decorated galas but had no place in the boardroom. But Elena didn't flinch. She came prepared, presenting files of Richard's reckless transfers, his misuse of company funds, and the undeniable proof of his affair with Melissa. "Richard thinks he's untouchable," Elena said firmly at one meeting. "But if his empire collapses, so will your investments. I'm not here to beg. I'm here to offer a future. Stand with me, and we rebuild something stronger. Stay with him, and you'll burn with him." The words landed like thunder. Slowly, one by one, heads began to nod. Shareholders who had once whispered doubts now voiced them openly. Some admitted they had been waiting for someone brave enough to challenge Richard. Margaret helped connect Elena to employees who had long been silenced by fear. An IT specialist delivered hard drives of incriminating emails. A financial officer handed over proof of offshore accounts. Piece by piece, Elena built her arsenal, and with each revelation, her coalition grew stronger. Meanwhile, Richard was oblivious. He and Melissa strutted through company halls as though they were already king and queen. At one staff meeting, Richard announced, "Big changes are coming. We'll have a new era of leadership soon." Melissa sat beside him, smirking like the throne was already hers. What neither of them realized was that the new era was already in motion, just not the one they planned. Lucas guided Elena every step. "You're not just fighting Richard," he reminded her. "You're showing these people that you are capable of leading. You need to prove you're not just his wife. You're Elena Carter, and you belong in power." So Elena worked tirelessly. By day, she moved gracefully through society, turning heads with her newfound confidence. By night, she strategized with Lucas and her growing circle of allies, mapping out the perfect moment to strike. But power always comes with risk. One evening, after a long meeting with two key shareholders, Elena returned home to find the nursery door ajar. She froze. She always kept it closed. Heart pounding, she stepped inside. The crib was empty. Thankfully, the baby wasn't here yet, but the mobile above it had been torn down, lying shattered on the floor. On the dresser was a single note, written in Richard's bold handwriting. "You can dress like a queen and talk like a leader, but you'll never win. Stop now, or I'll make sure you don't live to see our child born." Elena's breath caught, her fury burning hotter than ever. Richard thought threats would break her, but he had just given her the final reason to destroy him. The night of the annual Carter Foundation Gala arrived, an event Richard always used as his personal stage. Politicians, CEOs, and celebrities filled the grand ballroom of the Lakeshore Hotel, their laughter ringing beneath glittering chandeliers. Photographers swarmed the red carpet, eager to capture the man of the hour, Richard Carter, and his perfect life. This year, Richard wanted more than attention. He wanted dominance. With Melissa on his arm, dressed in a gown of shimmering gold that clung to her like a second skin, he looked like a king showing off his queen. The cameras flashed wildly as they stepped out of the black car, Melissa's hand resting possessively on his chest. "Mr. Carter, over here," reporters shouted. "Care to comment on the rumors of a leadership change at your company?" Richard smirked, glancing at Melissa before replying smoothly. "Change is always good when it leads to progress. Tonight, you'll see a glimpse of the future." Melissa's smile widened, her eyes sparkling with triumph. To her, this was their coronation. Inside the ballroom, guests fawned over them, raising glasses of champagne in congratulations. Richard basked in it, shaking hands, delivering charming lines, never once mentioning Elena. It was as if she didn't exist anymore. And that was exactly what he wanted the world to believe. But Elena had other plans. She entered quietly, without fanfare, accompanied by Lucas. The moment she stepped into the room, conversations faltered. Heads turned. Elena, radiant in a sapphire gown that accentuated her pregnant form, looked nothing like the fragile woman society had pitied. She glowed with strength, elegance, and undeniable authority. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Is that Elena Carter? She looks incredible." She doesn't look broken at all. She looks powerful. Melissa noticed first. Her smile faltered, her hand tightening on Richard's arm. "She's here," she hissed. Richard turned, his smirk stiffening at the sight of his wife. For a split second, his mask slipped and anger flashed in his eyes. But quickly he recovered, forcing a mocking smile. "Well, well," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Look who decided to crawl out of hiding." Elena didn't flinch. She met his gaze steadily, her voice calm and resonant. "I'm not hiding, Richard. I'm right where I belong." The room buzzed with tension. Guests exchanged glances, sensing something extraordinary was about to unfold. Lucas stood beside her, his presence quiet but commanding. He handed her a champagne glass, not filled with alcohol but sparkling water, and whispered, "Remember, tonight is yours. Don't let them see fear." Elena raised her chin, her eyes sweeping the ballroom. She wasn't just a betrayed wife anymore. She was a woman prepared to reclaim her life. Richard, desperate to maintain control, wrapped his arm tighter around Melissa. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced grandly, "allow me to introduce you to the woman who will stand beside me in the future of Carter Enterprises, Melissa Gray." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some clapped politely, others whispered in shock. Richard thought he had humiliated Elena in front of everyone. But Elena didn't waver. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the applause like a blade. "Funny, Richard," she said, her tone icy yet steady. "Because tonight, I've come to introduce the truth." The ballroom fell into a hush. Elena's words cut through the noise like a razor, freezing glasses midair and silencing whispered gossip. For a moment, all eyes shifted from Richard's smug grin to the radiant figure of his wife, the wife he had spent months trying to erase. Elena stood tall in her sapphire gown, her hand resting gracefully on her 7-month belly. The soft glow of the chandeliers framed her like a spotlight, making her presence undeniable. She wasn't a shadow anymore. She was the center of the room. Richard's smirk faltered. "Elena," he drawled, trying to mask his unease with sarcasm. "What truth could you possibly have to share? That you've spent months at home too delicate to function? Everyone knows you're—" "Enough." Elena's voice rang out, sharper than crystal shattering on the marble floor. The crowd stirred. Some leaned forward, sensing a storm about to break. Others exchanged excited glances, whispering. Finally, the wife speaks. Elena continued, her tone calm but fierce. "For years I stood beside this man, sacrificing everything. My career, my identity, my dreams. I believed in him, believed that our marriage meant loyalty. But tonight I stand here not as Richard Carter's wife, but as the woman he underestimated, the woman he tried to erase." Gasps rippled through the room. Melissa's face drained of color, her confident smile curdling into panic. She gripped Richard's arm tightly, hissing under her breath, "Do something." Richard's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Elena stepped forward, closer to the stage where the evening's speeches were meant to take place. Lucas followed behind her, silent but steady, carrying a sleek leather folder. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena addressed the crowd, her voice resonating with conviction. "You've been told a story of success. But success built on lies will always collapse. And tonight I'm going to show you the lies." The room buzzed with electricity. Cameras from journalists turned toward her. Board members straightened in their seats. Investors leaned forward, hungry for the revelation. Richard tried to laugh it off. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed. "Elena's not well. Pregnancy has made her hysterical. She doesn't know what she's saying." But Elena didn't flinch. She looked directly into his eyes, her expression steady. "Is that what you told Melissa when you promised her my place? That I was too weak, too broken, that I wouldn't dare fight back?" The crowd erupted with murmurs. Melissa's face flushed crimson. Richard's mask cracked. Elena took the folder from Lucas and held it high. Inside this are documents, transfers, and evidence that Richard Carter has been embezzling funds, using Melissa as his front. For months, they've been preparing to strip me of everything, even custody of my unborn child. But what they didn't count on is this. I am not powerless, I am not broken, and I will not be erased. The ballroom thundered with shock. Photographers surged forward, flashes exploding like fireworks. Shareholders muttered in outrage. Richard lunged toward her, his face twisted with fury. "You think you can destroy me with this circus act?" Elena didn't move. Her hand rested protectively on her belly, her eyes burning with unshakable resolve. No, Richard, she said coldly. I don't think it. I know it. The ballroom had never been so silent. Hello. Hundreds of eyes tracked Elena as she stood beneath the chandeliers, the leather folder clutched in her hands. Richard loomed behind her, his face twisted with rage, while Melissa clung to his arm, her golden gown shimmering like false armor. With steady fingers, Elena opened the folder. The crisp sound echoed through the hall, louder than the orchestra that had gone silent minutes earlier. She pulled out the first document and held it high. This, she said, her voice ringing clear, is a transfer of $5 million from Carter Enterprises into a shell company registered under Melissa Gray's name, signed by Richard Carter himself. Gasps rippled across the room. Investors leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Cameras flashed wildly. She laid another sheet on the podium. And here, emails between Richard and Melissa, conspiring to divert company funds while preparing legal papers to cut me, his lawful wife, from every shareholding. His plan wasn't just betrayal in love. It was betrayal in business, in law, in integrity. The murmurs grew louder, sharper. Shareholders whispered angrily to one another, flipping through their own programs as if searching for some anchor in the storm Elena had unleashed. Richard tried to step in, snatching at the papers, but Lucas blocked him smoothly, his tall frame shielding Elena. "You don't touch her," Lucas said, his voice low and deadly. Melissa's composure cracked. "She's lying," she screamed, her voice shrill. "This is fabricated. She's jealous because Richard chose me." Elena turned slowly, her gaze like steel. "Jealous? No, Melissa, I pity you because you've built your entire life on scraps of a man who uses people until they're empty. And tonight he's going down and he's dragging you with him." The crowd erupted. Journalists shouted questions, board members demanded answers, and flashes of light blinded Richard as cameras captured his paling face. Elena pulled out one final sheet, holding it up for all to see. "And here," her voice cracked like thunder, "is proof Richard Carter attempted to alter custody rights before my child is even born. He filed claims that I am unstable, unfit to be a mother. He sought to take my baby before I even had the chance to hold them." The ballroom gasped as one. Women covered their mouths in shock. Men shook their heads in disgust. The betrayal had crossed from corporate greed to something primal, tearing a mother from her child. Richard's voice roared above the chaos. "Enough! You think they'll believe you? You're nothing without me. Nothing." Elena's hand went to her belly, her voice calm but fierce. "You're wrong, Richard. I am everything without you. And after tonight, you'll be the one with nothing." The shareholders began to stand, one after another, their voices calling for an emergency board meeting. The once loyal investors who had followed Richard's every command now turned their backs on him, their anger echoing louder than the orchestra ever had. Melissa tugged at Richard's arm desperately. "Do something." But Richard was frozen, trapped under the weight of a truth he could no longer bury. Elena's gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of every ally she had gathered. And then she spoke the words that sealed Richard's fate. "Ladies and gentlemen, I move for Richard Carter's immediate removal as CEO." The room erupted like a storm breaking through glass. Shouts filled the air, board members rising to their feet, reporters firing questions, investors demanding order. The once revered Richard Carter stood at the center of chaos, his empire crumbling around him in real time. "Elena Carter has moved for Richard's removal as CEO," one shareholder shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "Given the evidence presented tonight, I second the motion." "I third it," another barked. Within moments, the ballroom had transformed into a courtroom, and Richard was the accused. Richard raised his hands, trying to silence the noise. "This is madness. She's hysterical. She's fabricating lies because she can't accept our marriage is over. You've all known me for years. I built this company from the ground up." But his words no longer carried the weight they once did. The investors had seen the documents, heard the accusations, and watched Melissa's guilty face pale with every revelation. His power, the thing he had guarded so ruthlessly, was slipping through his fingers. Melissa clutched his arm desperately. "Richard, do something," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Richard had no weapon left. A senior board member, a gray-haired man who had once been one of Richard's staunchest allies, stood and spoke with authority. "I trusted you with this company. We all did. But tonight proves you've betrayed us. betrayed every single person who believed in you. You're finished, Richard. Effective immediately, you are suspended, pending investigation." The declaration landed like a hammer. The room exploded into applause, some supportive, some furious, but all against Richard. Security guards moved closer, waiting for the signal. "No," Richard bellowed, slamming his fist against the podium. "You can't do this to me. This company is mine, mine." Elena's voice cut through his rage, calm and cold. "No, Richard. This company was built on the backs of people you exploited. You thought you could erase me, but tonight I erased you." Melissa finally broke. She turned on Richard, her voice shrill. "This is your fault. You promised me everything. You said no one would stop us." Richard rounded on her, fury blazing. "You were supposed to keep her quiet. You were supposed to make her disappear." The crowd gasped. Cameras caught every word, flashes lighting the ballroom like lightning strikes. Melissa's face twisted, realizing too late that Richard had just thrown her under the bus in front of the world. "Elena set you up," Melissa shrieked, pointing a shaking finger. "She played you, Richard, and you let her." Elena stood still, her hand on her belly, her eyes steady. For the first time in years, she wasn't the woman on the sidelines. She was the storm in the center of the room. Security moved in. Richard tried to resist, shouting at the board, at the cameras, at anyone who would listen. But no one did. The once powerful CEO was dragged out of the ballroom like a criminal, Melissa stumbling after him, her golden gown torn and her mask of confidence shattered. The crowd roared with whispers, cameras clicking furiously, investors shaking Elena's hand as they passed. She stood tall, glowing in the spotlight, not as Richard's wife, but as the woman who had toppled him. And as the doors slammed shut behind Richard and Melissa, Elena felt her baby kick inside her, strong and sure. For the first time, she knew the real fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The ballroom was still buzzing long after Richard and Melissa had been dragged out. The air, once thick with champagne and pretension, now crackled with something entirely new: vindication. Elena stood in the center, her sapphire gown glowing under the chandeliers, her hand resting on her rounded belly. For the first time in years, she felt weightless, as though the chains Richard had wrapped around her life had finally shattered. Lucas stepped forward, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "It's done," he said softly, his voice carrying both relief and admiration. Elena turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "No, Lucas, this is only the beginning. My child deserves a future free of his shadow." The shareholders gathered around her. Some offered apologies for not speaking out sooner, while others praised her courage. Margaret, the loyal secretary, squeezed Elena's hand. "You gave us hope," she whispered. "You showed us we don't have to live under fear anymore." Elena smiled faintly, her heart swelling. For months, she had felt invisible, erased. But tonight, she wasn't just seen, she was respected. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed, Elena found herself standing alone on the balcony overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline. The night air was cool against her skin, the city alive with lights that seemed to mirror her own rebirth. She placed both hands over her belly, whispering to her unborn child, "We did it. He can't hurt us anymore." The baby kicked gently, almost as if responding. Tears spilled down Elena's cheeks, but they were no longer tears of despair. They were tears of release, of freedom, of triumph. Behind her, Lucas approached quietly. "Elena," he said, his voice low, "you don't have to fight alone anymore. Whatever comes next, I'll stand with you." She turned, studying his face. The man who had once been just a friend now stood as something more. A pillar, a protector, someone who believed in her when she had nearly stopped believing in herself. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond survival. But even as hope bloomed, she knew the battle wasn't entirely over. Richard was humiliated, yes, stripped of his power and influence, but men like him rarely surrendered quietly. He would scheme, he would lash out, he would claw at whatever scraps of control he had left. Elena's jaw tightened. "He won't stop until he's destroyed himself," she murmured, "and when he does, I'll be there to make sure he never rises again." Lucas nodded, his expression resolute. "And I'll be there beside you." The city stretched out before them, vast and luminous. Elena inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with air that felt lighter than in years. Tonight, she had claimed her dignity, her voice, her power. Yet as the night deepened, her phone buzzed on the balcony railing. She glanced down. A single message appeared from an unknown number. "This isn't over. You took everything from me. Now I'll take everything from you." Elena's heart skipped, her hand instinctively covering her belly. The victory was hers, but the war was not finished. And as she stared out into the night, she knew the final chapter of her story was about to begin. Months passed since that fateful gala night. Richard and Melissa had vanished from the public eye, their reputations shattered, their names whispered only in shame. Investigations into Richard's financial crimes swirled in the press, and Melissa, abandoned and disgraced, was left clinging to the ruins of a life she thought she had stolen. For Elena, the world had shifted. No longer trapped in the shadows, she now walked boldly into the light. She had taken her rightful place on the board of Carter Enterprises, not as Richard's wife, but as a leader in her own right. Employees who once pitied her now respected her. Shareholders who had doubted her now sought her counsel. She was no longer invisible. But Elena's greatest joy came not from business, but from the moment her child was placed in her arms. In the quiet of the hospital room, she cradled her newborn daughter, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered, "You are my strength. You are my reason." Lucas was there, standing at her side, his eyes soft with admiration. He had held her hand through the delivery, never wavering, never leaving. In his steady presence, Elena found something she had thought lost forever: safety. Weeks later, on a warm spring afternoon, Elena walked down the aisle. The ceremony was intimate, held in the gardens of her family's estate, blossoms framing the path like a promise of new beginnings. She wore a gown of ivory lace that flowed over her figure. Her daughter nestled in Margaret's arms at the front row, cooing softly as though blessing her mother's happiness. Lucas stood waiting, his gaze steady, filled with devotion. When Elena reached him, he took her hands and whispered, "I loved you when you didn't see yourself. And I'll love you every day forward, for who you are, and for the future we'll build together." Elena's voice trembled as she replied, "You stood with me when I had nothing, and because of you, I found myself again. I promise to love you, not because I need saving, but because with you I am stronger." The vows sealed a chapter and began another. The guests, family, loyal allies, employees who had become friends, rose to their feet in applause. Elena kissed Lucas under the spring sunlight, her heart lighter than it had ever been. Later, as the reception wound down, Elena stole a quiet moment in the garden. She held her daughter close, rocking her gently, the baby's tiny fingers curled around hers, anchoring her to the present. She whispered softly, "We've been through fire, little one, but out of fire, steel is born, and together, we'll never bow to anyone again." The wind stirred, carrying the fragrance of roses and the sound of laughter behind her. Elena looked back at the crowd, at Lucas, at the life she had rebuilt. Richard had tried to erase her. Melissa had tried to replace her. But instead, Elena had risen higher than ever, turning betrayal into power, heartbreak into hope. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elena kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered the final vow of her journey. "Your mother is not weak. Your mother is unbreakable. And this is only the beginning of our story." So, that's how the story comes to an end. But my dear friends, if you're still here, still listening until this very moment, then I believe something inside this story touched your heart in its own way. Maybe it reminded you of pain you once carried, maybe it gave you strength, or maybe it simply whispered that you're not alone. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Elena's journey reminds us of that truth. She could not control Richard's betrayal or Melissa's cruelty, but she could choose how to rise from it. And Epictetus taught us, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. That is the heart of healing, turning wounds into wisdom. So tonight, as you sit here, think about your own battles. Think about the places where you've been underestimated, and remember, you are far stronger than anyone who tried to break you. If this story stirred something in you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs courage, and subscribe to our channel. Because together, we'll keep telling stories that heal.